the moral argument for God's existence, part 2. So we've looked at the first premise of the moral argument for God's existence. If there is no God, objective moral values and duties do not exist. And we've talked about how our experience tells us this is true. Now, and so that leads to the first box. So those of you who are filling these in, this is the first box under premise number 1. So this is kind of like our evidence. In some cases, it's going to answer objections. Without God, naturalism is true, and morality is an illusion. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, naturalism is the idea that the only thing that exists is nature, or that everything can be explained by natural causes. And if this is the situation, if there is no God, what we think is morality is actually an illusion, because we simply live in a world of physical cause and effect. And what we call morality is really nothing more than chemical reactions in the brain. And so let's press on this a little bit. If there's no God, and naturalism is true, well then human beings aren't really special, are they? And so there's no reason why we should value humans over anything else. There's absolutely no reason. Science can't give us a reason to value humans over any other animal. In fact, you could say that that's speciesism. How dare you prefer Homo sapiens over other species? But then, you know what? Then speciesism, that's not really a value either, is it? You couldn't say that that's morally wrong, because all morality is just an illusion if there's no God. Another way to consider it. You have no moral obligations. You have no objective moral obligations if there's no God. The reason is because we are only obliged to persons. Impersonal forces don't oblige us to anything, or I should say it this way, we're not obliged to impersonal forces or to nature. There's no moral obligation except to persons. And here's a way to think about it. If a great white shark, male, rapes a female great white shark, and maybe I shouldn't have used the word rape, if a male great white shark forcibly copulates, has sex with a female great white shark, and she's trying to get away, it's against her will, she doesn't want it to happen, we don't call that rape. We don't call it that. And we don't haul the male great white shark into a court of law and charge him with rape. Because there's no moral obligation, is there? None whatsoever. Or think about it this way. A lion kills a zebra. Is it murder? Well, the answer is no. Because we're only obligated to persons. Now, if there's no God and naturalism is true, well then maybe we should be arresting lions for killing zebras. But you can see that's absurd. You must have God. Without God, naturalism is true and morality is an illusion. Now here comes the objection. And for those of you who are looking along at the sheet, the objections are always going to appear in the right-hand column. And so I'm telling you what, if you ever engage in this discussion with somebody who's an atheist, I promise you they will object in this way. How dare you say all atheists are bad people? That's what they're going to say to you. How dare you say that? And they're going to try to make the argument into something that it's not. They're going to try to put words in your mouth. By the way, that's called a straw man argument. They're going to try to put words in your mouth that you're not trying to say. They'll say things like, oh, well now you're offending me. You're saying that I can't be a good person because I'm an atheist. Well, no, that's not what we're saying at all. Here's what the question is not. The question is not, must we believe in God to live moral lives? Obviously, you don't have to believe in God to live a moral life. That's not what we're asking. We're also not asking, can we recognize morality if we're atheists? Because we certainly can. You can both be a morally good person and recognize objective morality without believing in God. But that's not really the issue. That's not what we're saying at all. Here's the issue. The issue is not belief in God, but the existence of God. What we're saying is, if there is no God, you can't be good. Why? Because there is no good. If there is no God, there is no objective moral good. Therefore, you can't be good. So it's not about belief, it's about the existence of God. Now, let me clear this up a little bit more by giving you these examples. Here's why it's so imperative. If there is no God, there is no good. We can't be good without God because good doesn't exist without God. God is our standard to measure good and bad, right and wrong. And let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate this. Let's say I came to you and I said, hey, guess what? I went bowling the other day and I bowled a great score. I bowled 90. And 90 makes me a really good bowler. Now, if you know anything about bowling, you would probably be really skeptical of that, rightly so, and you would know that if I bowled a 90, I'm not a good bowler. Because how do you know what makes somebody a good bowler? What kind of score makes you a good bowler? Well, a perfect score in bowling is 200. That's the way that you can tell. And if I rolled a 90, I'm terrible. And by the way, the few times that I have bowled, I score anywhere from 90 to 100, which means I'm a terrible bowler. But without the perfect, you can never measure whether or not the other scores are good. Or let me give you another example. A few years ago, I did some tilling. The guy you see on the right is using a garden tiller. My dad was having some physical problems, and he needed to have his garden tilled. And now, the only thing is, with the tiller, you're not supposed to walk behind it. You're supposed to kind of walk to the side of it, because you don't want to pack the dirt down. And so I told my dad that I would till his garden for him. Man, it turned out to be really tough work. You think that tilling is easy, that you're just walking behind a machine that's breaking up the ground, but no, in fact, you stand to the side of it and you have to constantly steer it, and it's very difficult. And so I tilled my dad's garden for him, thought I did a good job, and then when I looked at it, it was crooked. It was curvy. It wasn't straight. And I was really disappointed in my own efforts. And as I sat there, not admiring my work, but feeling slightly bad about my work, although my dad was good with it, I thought to myself, how could I have done this better? How could I have actually tilled his garden straight? Well, what I could have done is taken a couple of stakes and hammered them down in the ground, and then strung up some line between those stakes and used that as a straight line. And I could have used that to keep my rows straight. I needed the perfect standard to determine whether or not my row was curved or straight. C.S. Lewis said, I would have never known what crooked is without knowing what straight looks like first. And the same is true with morality and God. You can never know what's objectively morally good without first having a standard. And that standard, if it's to be true for all of us, making it objective, has to be God. It has to be an unchanging, transcendent standard that's true for all people at all times. And so without God, at best, you can create a subjective standard of morally good, but you can never have objectively good. You must have God for that, because you must have a standard on which to base it. Okay, so if there is no God, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, here's another objection. It's called Euthyphro's dilemma. And it goes kind of like this. And I'll show you two different ways of looking at it. Is something good? It asks these two questions. Is something good because God wills it? Question one. Or is something good, or does God will something because it's good? Let me say those again. Is something good because God wills it? Or does God will it because it's good? Or let's put it another way. Is virtue good because God says so? Or is God good because he submits to virtue? Now, I'm asking those two questions just in slightly different ways. This is one of those gotcha questions. A dilemma is where you're given two choices, and none of those choices are very good. None of those are what you should choose. If we ask, is something good because God wills it? Is that what makes something good, simply because God wills it? Well, then that means that murder could be good if God willed it. So you see the problem. Or let me give another one. I'll keep using the two big ones that we all agree are objectively morally wrong. Rape. What if God willed that rape was good? Is something good just because God says so? If that's the case, then that means that morality is arbitrary. And if morality is arbitrary, if it's good simply because God says so, then that's not really a good foundation. That's not a good grounding for morality. And just as a side note, that's exactly what you get with Islam. Whatever Allah says is good makes it good. So on one day, Allah could say that killing that person or murdering that person is wrong. The next day, he could say that murdering that person is right, because it's whatever he says. But then we've got the other part of this dilemma. Is something good because God, does God will something because it's already good? Or is God good because he submits to virtue, saying it the same way? The second part of the dilemma means that morality is greater than God. If God is willing something because it's already good, or if God is good because he submits to virtue, that means that virtue is higher than him. Virtue or morality is higher, it's a higher good than God himself. And so it's kind of like a gotcha. Now, anytime you get a dilemma like this, what you need to do is recognize that there is another option. And so here comes the 1, 2, 3, the third box. This answers Euthyphro's dilemma. Well, God's nature is good, and God's will necessarily expresses his nature. All right, so God doesn't will things because they're already good, and God is not being arbitrary. It's not just what he says. God is willing the things that reflect his nature, because his nature is objectively good. In other words, God's nature is the grounding for objective morality. And it's really the only place where you can ground objective morality. Any other kind of morality is subjective. You must have a perfect standard, and you only find that in God. Okay, we'll look at some more in the next video.